Okay, so my topic today is performance analysis of transgender and intersex athletes. I have a book coming out in a few weeks. My publisher wants me to promote it, so there it is. First thing I'd like to say is that sexual biology is complex. It can be divided into several subcategories. These are the 7 categories that I use. Other people might use different categories. I would draw your attention to the last one here, gender identity. There is a substantial body of evidence to indicate that gender identity is primarily, if not entirely, biological. And that brings up an interesting question. We talk about sex as the biology of the male-female divide and gender as the sociological divide. But in fact, the two are interrelated. And you know, many people talk about the fluidity of gender, and it implies a one-dimensional continuum between male and female. But I actually like to think of gender as a two-dimensional graph. And across the bottom, I would put different types of gender, assigned gender, social gender, legal gender, and the vertical axis would be female at the top and male at the bottom where they belong. And you could have different levels of gender depending on the different category. Assigned gender depends on genitalia appearance at birth. Social gender depends on our gender identity. The legal gender is all over the map, all over the world. There are various rules depending on which country you're in. And this is not just some random graph. That's me. Up there, I was assigned male at birth. I live as a female. My Canadian passport says non-binary. And there are people who would suggest that any one of those 3 should be determinative when it comes to sports. And I would disagree with any of those. I would say that rather than look at any of these other 3, we should look at the biology that's important for sport when we decide how to divide athletes into male and female categories. I've called this concept athletic gender. Other people have used different terms. But let's see how this idea plays out when we look at transgender and intersex athletes. And let's start with transgender athletes. It is undoubtedly true that even after hormone therapy, transgender athletes will have advantages over cisgender or typical female athletes. On average, transgender athletes are going to be taller, bigger, and stronger than cisgender women, even after hormone therapy. And those are advantages in many sports. Joanna will talk more about the muscle memory, but it's definitely an advantage. And there are other advantages too. But transgender women also have disadvantages when compared to cisgender women. The idea that transgender women are bigger isn't necessarily an advantage because their larger frames are now being powered by reduced aerobic capacity and reduced muscle mass. And that leads to disadvantages, things like quickness, recovery, those sorts of things. And then of course it's true that there are sports where it's better to be smaller. And then beyond the physical disadvantages that transgender women have, there are mental and sociological disadvantages which are no less real. Transgender women have huge rates of depression and anxiety, and in so many countries the social disadvantages that transgender women have mean they'll never be able to compete in elite sport. But beyond talking about advantages or disadvantages, we need to think a little broader. And the important question isn't, do transgender women have advantages? The question is, can transgender women and cisgender women compete against one another in meaningful competition? Look, we allow left-handed fencers to compete against right-handed fencers. They have advantages. We let that go. But we don't let heavyweight boxers get in the ring with lightweight boxers. So, how big are the advantages that transgender women have? Can science help us? Hope so. There are a number of papers that have looked at muscle loss in non-athletic transgender women. And you can see that the numbers are not entirely consistent, but somewhere around a 5% loss of muscle mass using cross-section area of either the quadricep, the forearm, or the calf muscle. There are also DEXA scans that have been done on trans women, and they also lead to about a 5% loss of lean body mass. What about strength? Well, earlier this year there was a paper that came out of Stockholm, and they said that 1 year of hormone therapy did not result in strength loss, lower leg strength loss in trans women, and that got a lot of press. But the authors also admitted that there was a learning process in their study, and they should have had a control group. So the trans women probably did lose strength, made up for it by their learning. Interestingly enough, a far larger study got no publicity at all. The Stockholm study had 11 trans women. Study out of Amsterdam, Ghent, and Oslo had 249 trans women over a multi-year period, and they found a 4.5% loss of grip strength. So, there's some disagreement over strength loss and muscle loss in non-athletic women, or non-athletic trans women. And that's all interesting, but it doesn't have to do with athletes. And studies on trans athletes are extraordinarily rare. And to date, there's in fact only one published study, mine. And I took race times from 200 trans women and compared them using a metric known as age grading, where people are compared to the fastest time ever by somebody of their age and sex, and they put up equivalent age-graded scores suggesting that they were equally competitive in the male category before transition and the female category after transition. Look, it's a small study, it's only one sport, and it's not a strength sport. But I have continued to gather retrospective data. A rower, the standard measure is a 2K on the rowing machine. At 18, as a male, she rowed 7:01. At 20, she was 7:25 and had some improvement thereafter. If you assume the same improvement between 20 and 22 and 18 and 20, then she's approximately 10 to 12% slower. I have interesting data from a trans man. He's a swimmer. As you can see, he's put on a fair bit of muscle mass. He's also taken quite a bit of time off his 100-yard breaststroke. He was 103.1 as a high school girl. The last piece on here is 57.7. He actually has one more season on there that's not on this graph. He got down to 56.98, which is almost a 10% increase. It took him 4 years, but still he was able to increase his performance by about 10%. It's also useful to look at the performances of the very top transgender athletes in the world, and I'll highlight 3 of them. There's an Australian handball player. Her name is Hannah Mouncey. She's huge. She's 188 meters tall. She's 100 kilograms, and she played on the men's team for Australia. Certainly, people who are knowledgeable about handball would say she's going to be unstoppable in the women's. Well, she debuted last December in the Asian Championship, and pictures like this one flooded the internet, and this doesn't look very fair, does it? However, she didn't dominate. Hannah was the 3rd leading scorer for the Australian team. The Australian team finished 5th out of 10th in the Asian Championships. And all the best handball teams in the world are from Europe. And her team and herself as an individual did not dominate in that tournament. Hannah will be playing with the Australian team in a few weeks in the World Handball Tournament. They're ranked 22nd of the 24 teams in the tournament. Only 12 teams make it to the Olympics, so it's unlikely that Hannah and her team will be in the Olympic Games. But If you're interested, you can watch for a performance in a few weeks. Tifanny is a Brazilian volleyball player, and like many Brazilian athletes, she goes by a single name. Again, she's very tall, 192 meters, 1.92 meters. Her spike height after transition has decreased remarkably. And for those not familiar with the sport, the spike height is the height that above the floor that the hitter can reach when spiking. So she's lost 32 centimeters on her spike height. But she's still tall, strong, and technically savvy. The top league in Brazil is the Superliga Feminina, and she's the leading scorer in the league. But she's also a defensive liability. She recovers slowly, and she wasn't a defensive liability when she played in the men's. And so both her ability to hit the ball hard and as a defensive liability are different than they were before. And so she has some advantages and some disadvantages. Despite her success in the top league in Brazil, she was not named to the national team. The FIVB had requested that she not play internationally until they came up with a volleyball-specific rule. That was 18 months ago, and they haven't come up with a rule yet, and we'll talk about that later. So she didn't play for the national team in 2018 or 2019, and has a less than 50% probability of playing in the Olympics next year. Laurel Hubbard is a Kiwi weightlifter. Olympic weightlifting is a sum of two lifts. The snatch is one movement over the head. The clean and jerk, the clean is to the shoulders, the jerk is over the head, and you add up the total of the two weights. In 2017, she was second in the World Championships, and again, there was a lot of negative press over that. But 9 of the top countries were missing that year due to drug sanctions. She was injured seriously in 2018. She came back in 2019. Her first successful international competition was the Pacific Games in July of this year, where she won, and again got a lot of negative publicity. Interestingly enough, 2 months later, she lifted more than she had lifted any time before in the female category, but there was no publicity this time over her best performance. Why? Because she didn't win anything. She was 6th in the World Championships, which is still a terrific performance, but you know, she didn't beat everybody. And in fact, if you look at the very top, you can see she wasn't even very close to the medals. 332 kilograms versus her 285 was the winner. 303 kilograms with fourth place. Now, there's a lot of rules around who qualifies in weightlifting. We won't know for sure until next spring whether or not she does qualify. It's likely she will. She has an outside shot at a medal. Should that worry people? Well, let's look at some statistics. There's never been an openly transgender Olympian, but in Rio, there were 4,700 women who won 460 medals. Transgender people make up roughly 0.5% to 1%, or maybe 1 in 150. So we should be looking at 30 transgender women competing in Tokyo and winning 3 medals. That's not going to happen. There may be 2, maybe 3 trans women in the Olympics next year. So transgender women are still going to be hugely underrepresented in the Tokyo Games. So whatever advantages trans women have are still hugely outweighed by their disadvantages, largely sociological, but disadvantages nonetheless that they experience. Let's step back to research. As I showed you some of the retrospective data that I've gathered, but that's not really what you'd like to do as a researcher. You'd like to gather prospective data. I'm currently involved with 3 cases around the world. I found these trans athletes through social media. I alerted local labs wherever these people live, and they're currently being tested. One being tested in Colorado. She's a triathlete. We did her first test in May of 2017. She started hormone therapy in the summer of 2017, and you can see her peak VO2. She went down somewhat during her transition. It's a very volatile time. She's bounced back a little, but she's about 10% less than she was. She just had her gender confirmation surgery, gonadectomy, and we're going to test her at least once more before we look to publish these data. So this is pretty exciting, doing these little case studies, but again, it's still not really what you'd like to do. You'd like to do larger prospective studies, and I can't do that by myself. To do those, you're going to need exercise physiologists at universities combined with endocrinologists at gender clinics. And for the last year or 2, I've been trying to kick up interest in this, and there are 5 or 6 universities around the world that are actually starting up programs, and so it's pretty exciting. And 2 of those universities are in the United Kingdom, and represented with the speakers you'll have before you. Loughborough University is one of them. They convinced me to relocate, and so I'm now a UK resident. And we're just starting our program. We actually have our first participant. She just got approved for hormone therapy. We hope to do baseline tests on her in December and get her started on her hormone therapy for Christmas. Maybe next year I could get invited back and show you some of her data. So let's switch to intersex athletes. Intersex people are sometimes called people with differences of sexual development, or DSDs, and there's a lot of different intersex conditions. It's actually a very, very complicated thing. But when we look at sports, what we're most interested in are so-called XY DSDs, where human beings are born with a Y chromosome, which means testes, in this case internal testes, but the external genitalia can vary anywhere from typical female to typical male, and many times ambiguous genitalia are what these people possess. So it can be challenging using the standard metric of looking between the baby's legs to make a decision. I'd like to talk briefly about 2 XY DSDs. Complete androgen insensitivity, or CAIS, is a condition where the androgen receptors don't work the way they do for the rest of us. So despite the fact that these people have Y chromosome and testes and lots of testosterone in the blood, none of it gets into the cells. So women, and they're almost universally identified as women at birth with CAIS, have no advantage over other women because their testosterone just doesn't get to their cells. On the other end of the spectrum, in the XY DSDs, we have 5-alpha reductase deficiency, or 5-ARD, and those people are deficient in an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase type 2, and that is responsible for allowing testosterone to be reformatted into dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. In return, DHT is responsible for many things: male pattern baldness. It's also responsible for male genitalia. So these people with 5-ARD again have often ambiguous genitalia at birth. However, they are sensitive to their testosterone, and other than the deficit in DHT, they have all of the hormonal milieu and sensitivity of a typical male. So when they go through puberty, they go through a male-type puberty and gain virtually full male advantage. One of the burning questions is, should intersex athletes have fundamentally different regulations than transgender athletes? And I would say no. I think if you believe that, then you're prioritizing the biology that creates genitalia over the biology that creates brains. And certainly I would think as human beings, I would value brain biology over over genital biology when it comes to deciding who is male or female, but when it comes to deciding who is male or female for the purpose of sport, again, I think we should use the biology that's important for sport. So, a controversial decision from the IAAF. Their new rules in 2018 have restrictions on only 4 XY-DSDs, 5 alpha reductase and 3 other XY-DSDs, and only in a small subcategory of events, the 400 meters through the mile. I'm not sure that anybody is completely happy with this rule, but this is the rule that's in place. It's not an unreasonable compromise. And Jonas and I put together a paper last year where we calculated a 1,700-fold overrepresentation for these XY-DSD athletes, 25 years, Olympic championships, world championships, in the selected events on the podium. So that's a huge overrepresentation, and that gives you an idea of exactly why the IAAF targeted those events, because those are the events that intersex women have been incredibly successful in. So it's of use to point out that this hormone therapy is not required of intersex women unless they want to compete at international levels in these few events. In the case of Amanatu Seni from Niger this year was a very telling example. Her best event is the 400 meters, but she didn't run it in Doha. When asked why, she was very open. She said, you know, I have the same condition as Caster Semenya, and so I couldn't run the 400 with my natural hormone level. She moved down to the 200. She would have undoubtedly been a finalist in the 400. She was only a semi-finalist in the 200. Is this fair? It's right. It's a hard thing to say, but again, I think it's not an unreasonable compromise. Again, people like to talk about Caster Semenya, and with her natural hormone level, she couldn't have run the 800 in the World Championships this year, but she certainly could have run the 5,000. Her countrywoman Dominic Scott made the final of the 5,000, and Caster beat her in the South African 5,000 meter championships in the spring. So Caster certainly could have run the 5,000 and probably would have made the final. She chose not to. Again, these are difficult decisions and people can disagree on this, but this is where the field of play is right now. Lastly, just to talk about where we are, where we're going, I firmly believe that although it's not perfect, the best thing we have right now to determine what I call athletic gender, or what somebody else might call the separation of male and female athletes, is to use testosterone. Last month I was at a meeting sponsored by the IAAF where a number of different international federations attended, and we were talking about the future of regulations for transgender athletes. And it was very clear that the federations that were represented there were interested in looking at sport-specific regulations for their sport. And so it will be interesting to see what happens for 2020. Jonas and I were at an IOC meeting in June talking about transgender athletes. There was another meeting just a few weeks ago where neither Jonas nor I were invited. So the IAAF has very much said they're going to use 5 nanomoles per liter as the testosterone limit for both intersex women and for transgender women. It's unclear what the IOC will do, but in the end, it's not the IOC's decision who gets to the Olympics. It's the national federations in each country. And so it remains to be seen what will happen next year. but there will be lots of controversy, lots of interesting things will happen between now and Tokyo. Thanks for your attention.